Simon, better known to some of you in this room and in this Zoom as Peter. How many of you, by show of hands, are familiar with Simon Peter? Even just a little bit. All right. Can I get the Zoom folks back up there? I want to be okay. How many of you now? You can raise your hands again. Okay, great. I just want to be able to see everybody. Well, if you are familiar with Simon Peter, consider for a moment what you know about him. From stories you've heard or read over time, how would you describe Simon Peter in a word or a phrase? Consider that for a moment, and if you're joining us online, feel free to type descriptors of Simon Peter in the chat. And Dan, I'm going to need my phone, I think, for this. I forgot it over there. Thank you. All right. So feel free, if you're online, to type in descriptors, words or phrases that, in your recollection of Simon Peter, how you would describe him. And for those of you that are here joining in person, you'll have an opportunity to share any descriptors that you also have aloud in just a moment. But first, I want to officially welcome us all to the season of Lent. For those of you who may not be familiar with Lent, it is a 40-ish day period in the Christian calendar that leads up to Easter. Like Advent is to Easter, Lent is a time of preparation and anticipation for the celebration to come. But unlike Advent, Lent tends to have a heavier tone. It is structured around two events in our biblical canon: the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the wilderness before entering the land of Canaan, or the Promised Land, as well as the 40 days of temptation that Jesus experienced after his baptism at the start of his public ministry. So Lent is the 40 days, minus the feast days of Sundays, those are not counted in the 40 days, that lead up to Resurrection Day, or Easter. We officially entered the season of Lent this week on Valentine's Day, or otherwise known as Ash Wednesday. For some of us, we received the sign of the cross in ash on our forehead to remind us of our mortality, a vulnerability shared with our own Savior. As a season, Lent is meant to be one of reflection and self-examination. We are invited on an intentional journey, much like the Israelites, of wandering and exploration, a journey of vulnerability and trust. Historically, Lent has served as a reminder for Christians to look to God rather than physical things for their wholeness. For some, in line with what Jesus experienced in the desert, it is a time of fasting. Maybe it is for some of you today. Giving up certain foods or drink. Other indulgences, such as your regular forms of entertainment, devices or certain platforms, things of that nature. Perhaps it's giving up and refraining from activities or products that have greater negative impact on our earth. Some people also take on new practices in Lent. Perhaps a devotional or a wellness routine, perhaps service opportunities or specific acts of kindness. Some of us are better at these disciplines than others, but for all of us, Lent is designed to be a specific time of focus on our faith journey, on recognizing God in our midst and renewing our sense of design and purpose in God's kingdom here on earth. Here at Metro, we have chosen a theme for this year's Lenten season, using resources developed by a very talented and contemplative team at Sanctified Art. That theme is Wandering Heart, and it is centered around the disciple Simon Peter and framed within the hymn, Come Thou Fount, which we sang at the start of our service. Some might say Simon Peter had a wandering heart. How would you describe him? So some people have already started putting things in the chat. Let me see what we got in the chat for descriptions of Simon Peter. Here are, okay, hold on. Harder to see. Here we go. All right. The Rock, humble, strong, probably the most physically strong of the disciples. Simon was the John Lennon of the disciples. That one got a thumbs up from people online too. Denied Jesus, bombastic leader and believer who is also a great believer. Very human, impulsive, active, speaks first, thinks later, restless. What about you in the space? Do you have any additional descriptors of Simon Peter that you'd add to this list? Say them loud and I'll repeat them for people online. Eager? All right. Hot-headed. Authentic. Good job, church. This was good. This is actually better than I thought it was going to go. So good job. Thank you. Thank you for these descriptors. I'm going to put my phone over here now. So you can hear some of these descriptors are sort of follow each other, and some of them seem almost opposite to each other, right? Like it's interesting the way that we see Simon Peter. Well, we will get to these over the next 40 plus days together, but Simon Peter is someone who drops his nets and walks on water, while also being the same person who sinks and denies. He is resolute and wavering, both passionate and rash. At times he is nearsighted, while at other times seems to get the big picture. On this side of history, we might have a lot of opinions and judgments of him, but if we look closely at Peter, he is a normal human being trying to figure it all out, someone just like us. So today we start with the beginning of Peter's story, or at least the beginning of the story that we are told. I believe there is much more to Peter's story than what we are told, but this is what we get, and this is the beginning of what we get. In this story, he's still Simon. The name change will come, but it is not here yet. And for those of us who are more familiar with this story, it might be helpful to linger in the space before he is Peter, Petros, the rock. To remember that the one on whom the church was built was first just Simon, a fisherman trying to get by. And maybe that's who he continued to be, even when he was Peter. He was a person with a family, anchored in a community and a culture, subject to the realities of an unjust society from which he benefited as a man, but was on the margins of because of his trade and his class. It is Simon who encounters Jesus on this shoreline while washing his nets after a laborious night shift with nothing to show for it. I'm sure Simon just wanted to go home, count his losses, and get some rest. But instead, he is approached by Jesus, who has amassed a large crowd, wanting to hear what he had to say. And Jesus needed some space, and so he sought Simon for that space, getting in his boat, the same boat that had been out all night. And I asked Simon and his crew, the same crew that had been out all night, to take him out from the shore so that he could share the good news that the crowd was hungry for. After speaking, Jesus does something odd, or at least in my opinion. Instead of going back to shore, he turns to Simon and says, "Let's move farther out, to the deeper waters. There you should drop your freshly cleaned nets again." I mean, you can almost hear the exasperation in Simon's response. "Are you kidding me? I've been at this all night without a single catch. I've cleaned my nets. And you want me to go and drop them again? I also think about how Simon might have felt, being a professional fisherman who had spent his whole life on this lake, being told by a carpenter turned orator how to do his job. I know how my wandering heart would have responded to such patronizing. And yet Simon relents, believing, trusting, hoping in something not yet seen. I wonder what inspired him to do so. Was it something Jesus said to the crowds that gave him renewed energy? Just before this scene in chapter 5 of Luke, we learned that Simon had actually already encountered Jesus. In fact, Jesus had been at Simon's home and had healed his ailing mother-in-law along with several other people. Was it witnessing those healings that made Simon trust Jesus? Whatever it was, this act of faith paid off. Simon and his crew dropped the nets, and they were filled with fish. So much so that the nets and the boats and the people could hardly manage the bounty. Simon had to draw other fishermen and boats into this experience. And a bit of an aside, but encountering this story as someone who is surrounded by messages of scarcity in our society and in our politics and in our culture, I am inspired by this response to abundance that I see. There's no sign that Simon and his crew tried to reserve this bounty for just themselves. They didn't keep it secret or hoard the fish. They shared the bounty and the good news, understanding that there was more than enough for all. And let us not forget, church, followers of this good news, that is the message that we must share and amplify today as well. There is enough. It is at this moment that Simon seems to understand just who Jesus really is, the long-awaited Messiah. And yet something about this experience and this bounty makes Simon cower. He suddenly becomes acutely aware of his unworthiness. He almost seems ashamed in that moment, doesn't he? It's hard to know exactly what he is feeling. Perhaps he is expressing sort of his internalized caste in this society as a fisherman. He would be on the lower end of things. And maybe in the realizing that he was in the presence of the Messiah, he felt unworthy in that place. Maybe there was something that he just didn't feel quite himself. Or maybe the abundance itself scared him. Has abundance ever scared you? And yet Jesus assures Simon and the others, do not be afraid. Do not cower or retreat. Come and follow me, Jesus says, and there will be even more abundance. You will find meaning and wealth in places you've never imagined, and together we will lift others up. We will catch people. And with that, Simon begins his journey with Christ, his journey to Peter. I don't know where you find yourself this Lenten season, but perhaps you have found connection today with the wandering heart of Simon Peter. Perhaps you entered this season hungry for a miracle or even a sign that things could be different. Perhaps you are looking for a change in direction or purpose. Perhaps you are ashamed and need to hear, do not be afraid. You are beloved and just what is needed in this world. Perhaps you entered this time with perpetually empty nets. Depression, anxiety, professional or relational disappointment, societal disappointment, the understanding of lack of justice. You have tried and tried to fill those nets, but continue to haul in little to nothing. Maybe you are tired, have lost hope, and are ready to give up. If that is the case, you will find no judgment here, because most of us have been there too. Some of us still are. And the call to cast your net even one more time feels pointless and ridiculous, even counterproductive. Yet let us heed Jesus' call to put out into the deep water and let down our nets for something unexpected. Let us go to the deep waters, where, yes, more work is required, but where more abundance can be found. And it is good to notice in this that the casting of nets is not and was not done alone. It is done in community with others. Simon may have received the call to cast his net, but it is pretty clear from our text that he had the help of others in doing so. So we go at this together, this Lenten journey. This Lent, I invite you to walk with Simon Peter. Consider your own faith journey. Like Simon Peter, I encourage us to bring all of who we are into this Lenten season. Let us try not to shield ourselves from the parts of our being that we find disappointing, less desirable, more shameful, or not up to par. And it will not be easy to come just as we are, because the world we are accustomed to doesn't make it easy to be ourselves. We learn early to diminish ourselves, to code switch, to honor our shame. But Jesus seeks us, finds us just as we are. Jesus sought you and continues to seek you still. May you go and find God in return. Amen.